The ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York smelled like money and fresh lilies, and every single person in it had been hand-selected to witness one man's triumph. That man was Gregory Harmon. His new bride stood beside him near the entrance, adjusting the pearl buttons on her ivory gloves, laughing at something one of the groomsmen said. She had the kind of laugh that filled a room, loud and deliberate, designed to be heard. Her name was Celeste. No, that was someone else. Her name was Fiona Marsh, and 6 months ago she had been Gregory's personal assistant. 8 months ago, Gregory was still married to Audra Sinclair, but that's getting ahead of things. The invitations had gone out 3 weeks before the wedding. Cream cardstock, gold lettering, the kind of envelope you hold carefully because you're not sure if you're supposed to open it or frame it. Most people called them beautiful. Audra Sinclair opened hers at the kitchen table in the small apartment she'd moved into in the Parkdale neighborhood. The one with the radiator that clanged every night at 2 in the morning and the view of someone else's brick wall. She read her name on the envelope twice. Then she set it down and poured herself a glass of water and stood at the window for a long time. She knew exactly why she'd been invited. Gregory had made no secret of the life he was building without her. The Instagram posts, the Toronto Life feature on his company's expansion, the quotes from close friends about how he'd finally found his equal. Audra had seen all of it because her daughter Hazel, who was 9, still used Audra's old tablet to watch videos, and the algorithm had figured out the rest. The invitation wasn't kindness, it was theater. Gregory wanted Audra in that ballroom because he wanted her to see what she had lost, what she would never be part of again, what she had allegedly held him back from becoming. He wanted to look across the room and find her face and see something collapse in it. He had always been good at wanting things. What people who hadn't known them before the divorce didn't understand was that Audra had been the one who put him through his MBA. She had worked as a radiographer at St. Michael's Hospital for 11 years, the kind of job that starts at 6 in the morning and ends when it ends. The kind of job where you learn very quickly that the body keeps its own accounting. She had covered the tuition, the rent on their Leslieville row house, the groceries, the car payments. She had made lunches. She had driven to the airport at midnight to pick him up from conferences in Vancouver and Calgary. She had smiled at every dinner party and remembered the names of every colleague's spouse. Gregory had graduated and started Harmon Capital Group, and within 3 years the company was managing portfolios worth more than most people's lifetimes. He had thanked her in his first investor letter. He had kissed her at the office Christmas party and said, in front of people, that he wouldn't be standing there without her. Then Fiona Marsh had joined the team as his assistant. Audra hadn't confronted him dramatically. She hadn't thrown things or screamed in the driveway. She had asked him directly, once in the living room after Hazel was asleep, and his answer had taken only a few seconds, but it had rearranged everything. He wasn't in love with her anymore. He hadn't been for some time. He was sorry for the timing. He thought they both deserved more. More. She had signed the divorce papers 8 months later. The settlement was not what she deserved, legally speaking. Her lawyer had told her that. And she had nodded and signed anyway because she was tired and Hazel had been crying in her sleep, and Audra couldn't spend another season in that house. She took enough to move. She took Hazel and a set of pots and the framed photograph from their honeymoon in Prince Edward Island. Not because she wanted it, but because she thought someday Hazel might. She had not planned to go to the wedding. She had put the invitation on the kitchen table and walked past it for 4 days. Her sister Rochelle had called and told her to throw it in the recycling. Her friend Bernadette had offered to come over with wine and a shredder. Audra had laughed at both of them and said she'd think about it. What changed her mind was something small. It was a Tuesday evening in October, and Hazel was doing her homework at the kitchen table, and she looked up from her worksheet and said, completely unprompted, "Mom, are you sad?" Audra had said, "No, baby, I'm fine." Hazel had looked at her with the particular directness that 9-year-olds have before the world teaches them to soften their observations, and said, "You look like you're trying really hard not to be sad." Audra had sat down at the table and helped Hazel with her multiplication tables, and felt something harden quietly inside her, not with anger exactly, but with something cleaner than anger. A kind of refusal. She was not going to spend the rest of her life looking like she was trying hard not to be sad. She called the hair salon the next morning. What Gregory did not know, what almost no one in that ballroom knew, was that Audra Sinclair's life had changed considerably in the 14 months since the divorce. It had not changed in any way she'd planned or expected or frankly wanted. She had been getting through the days, mostly. Going to work, picking up Hazel, cooking dinner, answering emails, doing the ordinary things that keep you from falling into the space where grief lives. She had started running in the mornings along the waterfront. Not because she loved running, but because it used up the early hours when she couldn't sleep, and it gave her somewhere to put her body. It was on one of those runs, in February, on a Thursday when the temperature was -11 and the lake was frozen to the breakwater, and she was the only person in the world stupid enough to be outside, that she had nearly collided with a man walking 2 enormous dogs and carrying a coffee in each hand. His name was Warren Ossie. He was a structural engineer who specialized in bridge restoration, which meant he spent a lot of time in waders at the edges of things, assessing what held and what didn't. He had grown up in Brampton, gone to university at Waterloo, worked a decade in London before coming home to care for his father, who was now doing well, thank you for asking. He had offered her the second coffee. She had said she didn't take coffee from strangers. He had pointed out that it was -11 and she seemed to be in distress. She had told him she was not in distress. She was running. He had said those two things were not mutually exclusive. She had taken the coffee. They had walked the waterfront for 40 minutes. She had not given him her phone number. She had thought about him for the rest of the week. She'd run into him again the following Thursday. Same stretch of path. Same 2 dogs. It turned out he lived 3 blocks from her. It turned out they used the same pharmacy and had been buying the same brand of hand cream. It turned out that his father's birthday was the same day as her daughter's. These coincidences had accumulated, quietly, like snow, until neither of them was pretending they were accidental. They had been together for 11 months by the time the wedding invitation arrived. Warren did not tell her what to do with the invitation. He sat with her at the kitchen table on the 4th evening, when she finally showed it to him, and he read it and set it down and was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to go?" he asked. "I don't know. That's not what I asked." She thought about Gregory's face when he'd said he wasn't in love with her anymore. She thought about Hazel crying in her sleep. She thought about the settlement she had accepted because she was too tired to fight. "Yes," she said. "I think I do." He had nodded. He had said nothing about what it might mean, or what people would think, or whether it was a good idea. He had simply said, "Then we'll go." She had looked at him across the table and thought, not for the first time, that the thing about Warren was that he assessed structures. He knew what held. The morning of the wedding, Audra dropped Hazel at her sister Rochelle's and came home to her apartment and stood in front of the dress she had bought the previous Saturday. It was a deep emerald green, bias cut, with a cowl neck and a low back that required some confidence to carry. The woman at the Yorkville boutique had said it was made for someone who knew what they were doing. Audra had stood in the dressing room and thought about that for a while. She had bought it. Warren arrived at her apartment at 4 o'clock in a dark navy suit that he'd had pressed, and a tie that was almost but not quite the same green as her dress. He brought her coffee. He looked at her in the doorway and didn't say anything for a moment. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just nothing." She understood. The car he had arranged was not a limousine, which is what Rochelle had suggested with great enthusiasm. It was a black Lincoln driven by a man named Owen who had worked with Warren on the Gardner restoration project and who was, Warren said, the best parallel parker in the city. This seemed like an odd credential until Owen pulled up to the Fairmont's curved entrance without a single wasted movement, and the valet who opened Audra's door had the expression of a man who respected competence. Gregory saw her before she saw him. He was standing near the bar with Fiona and 2 of his investors, laughing at something, looking exactly as he'd looked at every company event she'd ever attended at his side. Polished, comfortable, in complete possession of the room. Then he turned toward the entrance and his laugh didn't stop exactly, but it recalibrated. Something shifted in his jaw. Audra was not watching him. She was giving her coat to the coat check and saying something to Warren that made her smile, and she moved through the entrance hall with the easy certainty of someone who had decided, before walking through the door, exactly who she was going to be tonight. Several people noticed her at the same moment. Some of them recognized her, and some of them didn't, but all of them registered the entrance in the way that certain entrances demand to be registered. Not because of the dress or the man beside her, though both were considerable, but because of something in Audra's bearing that said, "I am not here to explain myself." Fiona Marsh, who was 28 and had won by conventional measures, felt a sensation in her chest she couldn't immediately name. What no one in that room except Warren knew was what Audra had been doing for the past 10 months on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. After the divorce, she had quietly retained a lawyer, not the tired one who had helped her with the settlement, but a different one. Her name was Winifred H.E.B., and she worked in a glass tower on Bay Street and had the kind of stillness that comes from having seen every version of a particular kind of mess. Audra had found her through a colleague at the hospital, and she had gone to the first meeting thinking it was probably nothing, probably just paperwork she'd overlooked, probably a waste of an afternoon. It was not nothing. What Winifred found, carefully, methodically, across 16 months of financial records, was that Gregory had structured the growth of Harmon Capital Group in a way that deliberately obscured assets in the years leading up to the divorce. The portfolio hadn't been worth what the settlement documents had claimed. The real valuation had been significantly higher, significantly. In Canadian family law, the division of property during a marriage is based on the net family property calculated at the date of separation. If that calculation is falsified, if assets are hidden or misrepresented, the settlement can be revisited. Winifred had revisited it. Audra had not told her sister, or her friends, or Gregory's family, with whom she maintained a careful civility for Hazel's sake. She had told Warren in October, the week after he had said then, "We'll go," sitting at the same kitchen table with tea going cold between them, because she didn't want to walk into that wedding, carrying a secret that felt like ammunition, without telling the person walking in beside her. Warren had listened to the whole thing. He had asked 2 questions, both practical. Then he had said, "I think you should do whatever makes you feel like yourself again." She had not cried. She had come close. The legal proceedings were ongoing. They were, as Winifred said, progressing well. Gregory found his way to her side during the cocktail hour. She had anticipated this. She had discussed it with Warren and with herself, and had decided that she would be pleasant and unremarkable, that she would give him nothing, not anger, not softness, not the satisfaction of knowing she had spent 14 months trying not to look sad. She would simply be Audra Sinclair, who was doing fine, who had moved on, who had worn green to his wedding because green suited her. He came with a flute of champagne and the expression of a man who expects to feel powerful. "You came," he said. "I was invited," she said. There was a pause in which he seemed to recalibrate again, the same way his laugh had recalibrated at the entrance. He looked at Warren, who was nearby, talking to a woman he'd recognized from the engineering association, and his face did something complicated. "You look," Gregory started. "Thank you," Audra said before he could finish, because she did not need him to finish. He tried once more. "I hope you're—" "I am," she said, simply, completely. He stood there for another moment, holding his champagne flute, and she could see him understanding, slowly, that there was no version of this conversation that would give him what he had wanted from it. He had wanted her diminished. He had wanted her present, precisely because he expected presence to hurt her. He had not expected her to be at peace. The worst thing you can do to someone who wanted to hurt you is to arrive healed. He excused himself. She watched him go and felt, in the place where grief had lived, something that wasn't quite satisfaction. Calmer than that. More like a closing door. The dinner was well catered and long. Warren was good company at events like this. Attentive without being performative, funny without needing the room to know it. The kind of person who remembers what the person beside him ordered and makes sure the server doesn't miss them on the second round. Audra had watched him figure out that the older woman at the next table was hard of hearing and quietly shift his chair so she could read his face when he spoke. He hadn't mentioned it. He'd just done it. She thought, not for the first time, that she had been wrong about what love looked like. She had spent 12 years believing that love was the big gestures, the investor letters, the kissing at Christmas parties. She had not understood until recently that love is mostly the second thing. The quiet adjustment of a chair, the coffee at -11, the sitting at the kitchen table and saying, "Then we'll go." During the toasts, Gregory stood and spoke about Fiona in the language of men who have recently discovered what they were missing. Electric, passionate, transformative. Finally, exactly what he'd been looking for. He looked at Fiona while he said it, and then once looked out at the room, and Audra knew he was looking for her face. She was listening to something Warren was saying quietly near her ear, and she laughed at it, and she did not look up. It was near the end of the evening that Winifred's name appeared on Audra's phone as a text message. Audra excused herself and stepped into the corridor near the coat room and read it. Motion approved. Disclosure order granted. Gregory's financial records compelled by court order, effective Monday. Thought you should know before the weekend. She stood in the corridor for a moment. The coat check attendant gave her a politely neutral look. From inside the ballroom, she could hear the band starting into something upbeat, something meant to get people onto the floor. She thought about the kitchen table in Leslieville, the radiator that clanged, the framed photograph she'd taken because someday Hazel might want it. She thought about the Tuesday evenings in Winifred's glass tower, going through documents page by careful page, refusing to accept that the accounting was closed. She put her phone back in her clutch. She went back inside. Warren looked up when she returned and read her face in the way he had learned to read it and said nothing, only put his hand briefly near hers on the table, in a way that was not quite touching, just close enough to feel. Good? He said quietly. Good, she said. Gregory and Fiona Marsh danced their first dance to a song Audra didn't recognize, something new and produced sounding, and the room watched with the particular attention reserved for moments that are supposed to be witnessed. Fiona looked radiant. Gregory looked like a man who had gotten what he wanted. In the weeks that followed, when the disclosure order was served and the financial records began their slow, thorough journey into Winifred Achebe's office, Fiona would hear about it. She was not a stupid woman. She had managed Gregory's calendar and communications for 2 years, and certain things would clarify themselves as she reviewed what she'd known and hadn't known, and had perhaps chosen not to look at too directly. The conversation she and Gregory would have in their kitchen 3 weeks after returning from their honeymoon in Tuscany was not one either of them would describe as good. But that was later. Audra left the wedding at 10:30. She retrieved her coat and found Warren finishing a conversation with the structural engineer colleague he'd run into, and he wrapped up the conversation in the way he did everything, competently, without drama, and held her coat. On the way out through the hotel lobby, she passed a mirror near the elevator bank. She didn't stop, but she caught her reflection for a moment. The green dress, the straight back, the expression of a woman who had done what she came to do and was ready to go home. She looked, she thought, like herself. Fully. For the first time in a long time. Owen was waiting at the entrance. The evening had turned cold in the way that Toronto evenings turn cold in October, sudden and total. And she pulled her coat close and breathed in the air off the lake somewhere south of them. That particular mineral smell of water and wind that had been the backdrop to everything. To the runs in February and the conversations at the kitchen table, and the careful, patient work of becoming someone who wasn't trying hard not to be sad. On the drive home, Warren asked her how she was feeling. She thought about it honestly, the way he had taught her by example to think about things, without performance, without the answer she was supposed to give. I feel like I got my own accounting right, she said. He looked at her sideways in the dark of the back seat. Good, he said. It was always yours. Hazel was asleep at Rochelle's. The radiator in the Parkdale apartment would clang again at 2 in the morning. The court documents were moving through their patient legal machinery. And Audra Sinclair, in a green dress in the back of a black Lincoln, moving through the October streets of her own city, was, for the first time in longer than she could name, entirely at ease.